The practice of feeding worms. Why practice? Because that's what it is. It's practice. The more we do it, the better we get at it, and there's always something new to learn. First thing I would suggest is just do some research. There's no end of information on the internet about what to feed your worms and what not to, and that's the first great place to start. Is do your research and see what you can learn. The consensus seems to be no meat, dairy, fat, or cheese, and that all makes perfect sense. They also recommend you don't feed citrus fruits that are high in acid, or anything that's too acidic, or spicy stuff. Then we have a gray area of things that people feed in moderation. I haven't had much luck with anything except the tomatoes, actually. The worms seem to like the tomatoes, but they're a little bit acidic, and if they're not crunched up, you can run into a fruit fly thing. Potatoes, unfortunately, potatoes are one of those things that you just wish you could use the potato peels for something, and I haven't found anything that's really useful for potato peels. So if you guys know of something that potato peels are really good for, let me know. The worms don't like them. They just kind of sit in the bin, and maybe in 6 months they'll eat them, but for the most part, I'm just growing another potato crop out of peels in my worm bin. So I don't think you'd probably want to feed a lot of potato peels to your worms. Old bread, rice, or pasta, in moderation, and that seems to be the key. Moderation, just a little bit, and see how it goes, and wait for them to eat it up before you add some more. Don't go throwing a whole bunch in there and expecting it all to be gone like some miracle overnight. So for browns, you should try and find something that's cheap and readily available. Shredded cardboard, newspaper, leaves, sawdust, or wood chips all make great bedding for your worms. And the cool thing about worms is they have the ability to take these things that would normally take a long time to break down, and break them down relatively quickly into really super great worm castings. The great thing about browns is it's pretty hard to have too many browns in your mix. You want lots of browns. We like to feed the worms the stuff that the chickens aren't fussy about, like carrot peels, cauliflower and broccoli stalks, banana peels, cucumbers, cabbage, pulp from juiced vegetables such as carrots or beets, celery. I guess as well as greens, I'm going to include coffee grounds and tea bags, just stuff like that that chickens don't like, but the worms just think is good food. Of course, there's other stuff that the worms like to eat, but our chickens like to eat them too, so they have to share. We usually give a little bit to the worms and the rest to the chickens, and that seems to work out pretty good. Leafy greens are a little bit past, or pumpkins, or zucchini, or squash. There's no end to stuff. Just make sure that it's not moldy. It can be a little bit past being what you'd want to eat, but you don't want to introduce a bunch of mold or slimy yuck into your worm bin, because once it goes that bad, it can have some toxins in it that could be hard on your worms and not good for the biology in the worm bin. I guess my point here is to feed a wide variety of different kinds of food, and not to make any big changes at once. Whatever you're feeding or using for bedding, make your changes slow to allow the biology and the worms to get used to eating different kinds of food or living in different kinds of bedding. It just keeps the worm bin functioning smoothly. Now that we've talked about all the things that worms can eat, I'm going to tell you, don't overfeed them. If you overfeed worms and things go wrong very quickly. But if you underfeed worms and things go wrong very slowly. So it's better to underfeed and evaluate what's going on than to dump too much feed in there and have your worm bin go south on you too quickly. And I think that's pretty good advice. One thing I've found is there's all kinds of conflicting information out there about how much composting worms can convert from food into worm castings in a given period of time. And there are just so many factors that depends on that really you just have to evaluate your own situation, put a little bit in there, see what's happening, evaluate it, maybe add some more food or let it dry out or add some more water. But just don't go blindly by putting in so much food and expecting everything to go okay. You want to get in there and see what's happening and make changes accordingly. You can see this is why I'm not going to be feeding too many potatoes in here. This one's ready to go out in the garden if it wasn't November. It's important to remember that a worm bin is an ecosystem, and worms aren't the only one living in there. So there's going to be other different kinds of creatures living in with your worms depending on what you add. One thing that you can run into trouble with is fruit flies if you add too much fruit. So I tend not to add fruit to my worm bin when it's in the house. It's something I would do outside because the fruit flies wouldn't be such a nuisance. But in the garage or in the house, I don't add a whole lot of fruit, and if I do, I bury it really deep just to avoid the fruit flies. Some people would use maybe rabbit manure or something, but that's something I might try outside, but I would probably never do that in the house. I do use some of our well-composted cattle manure, but it's been composted for a year and is broken right down, and it's pretty inert at that point, but the worms seem to love it, and I don't have any trouble using it as a portion of my bedding in my worm bin. Something I've had great success for is our potting soil that we used in our pots last season. We don't use a lot of chemical fertilizers, so I'm pretty confident that this stuff doesn't hurt our worms at all. And there's still peat moss in there. We took it out of the pots and ground it up a little bit just by hand and then sifted it. So we've got really good bedding material here. It's just really devoid of nutrients and life at this point. So it's just a great way to recycle this. Normally we throw this on the compost pile or in the garden, but we can run this through the worm bin because, like I say, there's hardly any chemical fertilizer in this at all. So the worms they just love it, and it's a great way to recycle it. Just to sum up the practice of feeding worms, do a little bit of research. There's no end information out there. Find yourself some free or cheap sources of bedding. There's no end to that out there. Feed your greens a little bit at a time and evaluate how things are going. There's no replacement for going in there and looking with your own two eyes to see how things are going, rather than relying on what somebody tells you should be adding, because your worms may or may not be using it as quickly as some of the information out there. If you feed too much, things can go wrong really fast, but if you feed slow, things go wrong really slowly. So you're better off to feed a little bit slower and have some time to make adjustments. And I guess my last piece of advice is, if you've got more greens than you can use at one point, freeze them. This is some juiced carrot pulp and some juiced tomato pulp, and we have some juiced beet pulp as well. We just had so much of it in the fall, and I just froze these in muffin trays. And the next day I popped them out, threw them in a plastic bag, and I've got no end of green stuff that's perfect for worms, just all ready to go. Take them out, thaw them out, and throw them in with the worms a little at a time. And that'll last me a couple of months doing that. Way better than throwing a whole bunch in at once and ended up with a mucky mess. But you could do that with chopped up pumpkins or zucchini, or anytime you've got more than your worms can do in one shot. Freeze it and just dole it out to them a little bit at a time. I hope that helps, and yeah, thanks for watching.